Thank you for inviting us to talk about optimizing your park, programming, real estate, and planning. My name is Amy Bridger. I'm the Senior Director of Corporate Strategy and External Engagement for Penn State Erie, the Barron College. And I'm here with my colleagues, Tom Hardy and Chuck Peters, to use Knowledge Park at Penn State Erie as the basis and case study for what we would like to talk to you about today, which is people, places, and systems, and how when you can balance and optimize those three things together, you can really be a lot further ahead in being a successful park. I should mention in the beginning that Knowledge Park is based on Penn State Barron's undergraduate enrollment. We're largely an undergraduate institution. So when we talk about things, that's kind of the framework of where we are. When we talk about systems, what we're going to talk about today is from a national scale and then narrow down to Penn State Barron's system and then narrow it down even further into Knowledge Park. And then we're going to talk about how we can assess the people into that framework to be most successful. From a national perspective, for years, higher education has really put a large focus on experiential education, but there continues to be a mismatch of perceptions. For instance, Weiss in 2014 stated that 96% of chief academic officers asserted that their graduates were workforce ready, but only 11% of business leaders agree. We also see that on the right, under figure 1, that talks about the behavioral and technical competencies of students, where they feel like they're proficient, and then the employers that actually rated them as well. And you see a complete mismatch of scores from one to the other. So what we can talk about then is that experiential education might be important, but it actually is not helping this mismatch of perceptions. What is helping are things like internships. And we know that students that take internships where they apply their knowledge in real world situations with the industry partner there actually have twice the chance of getting a job upon graduation. We also know that only 1/3 of undergraduates actually have those internships. On the national scale, what I'd like to talk about systems are two different slides. And you may have seen these slides, you may watch these slides from the National Science Foundation. But in terms of where business lies, in terms of stakeholders, it's important to realize that under total R&D expenditures, the federal government has a 60-year decline from 1953, and this ends at 2015. And business and industry is really picking up the slack. And that's important to note because we have research that we do in higher ed and we have our output as students. And both of those are seeing businesses being increasingly important as stakeholders. In terms of who is performing research and development, that top green line that's dark is industry. And the orange line is higher ed. The federal government, which we've been relying on for years to provide dollars for research, is actually the dark blue line, which is under higher education. So it's another example where from a systematic perspective, industry and business should become a higher stakeholder profile than what they are. And they've been asking to be a part of that since the 1970s, but higher education has really been resistant to that change. So from a system perspective in Penn State Barron, we have about 5,200 students, primarily undergraduates, over 4 schools: business, engineering, humanities and social sciences, and the Science College. When we talk about our curricular piece, Barron has a long history of already identifying and integrating with the industry in our area. So for instance, we are well known for our plastics engineering, which ties in really nice to the plastics manufacturing sector that is located in northwestern Pennsylvania. We have a strong focus in the environment, and our campus is located 2 miles from Lake Erie. And the plastics that end up in the water, microplastics, provides a unique opportunity for us to cross-sect the environment with the manufacturers that exist in our community. We also have a strong strength in women's health due to the hospital systems that are located here. So you can see that our strengths on the curricular side are already tied to industry. And that's been a decades-long initiative that we really focus on, which we formalized in 2010. We call it the Open Lab Strategy. It has a bunch of different components to it, all trying to reduce every barrier for industry engagement. One is a really industry favorable intellectual property policy. One is the fact that we hire faculty from industry, which means they not only walk and talk in a way that their students will encounter when they get into the real world, but also they bring their networks with them. We also have specialized equipment on campus that will entice industry to come work with us and our students to learn what that equipment is and how to run it. We also can run up to pilot production on campus, which is important. And we focus a lot on applied research and development. But one of the cogs in the wheel that we want to focus on today is Knowledge Park. And Knowledge Park is just one piece of this strategy. But the park is a 106-acre park with 6 buildings, over 20 tenants at this point. We just signed a lease last week. And over 500 employees call the park home on a daily basis for their job. What's important about the park is it's a little bit different than you would see at a really large research park. We focus on applied. We focus on companies that come here that want to engage with our students in a day-to-day basis. And we require that the tenants in the park actually do engage on campus to further the student education. And that can happen in a variety of different ways. But we don't do just singular research. We're not here just for research. It's really engagement with the students. And that's part of why we have the experiential component that we've talked about in higher ed for years. But now we're taking it one step further and actually moving our campus closer to the industry that is ultimately going to hire our undergraduates. The tenants can engage in several different ways. They could hire interns. They could hire full-time. They could be there and give us input on our curriculum. They could have continuing workforce development with their own employees. We do research, for sure, over $6 million a year, and we also have industry serve on industry advisory boards. What we found in our park is it's really important to focus on existing companies. Doesn't mean that we don't have startup companies, but we really focus on existing companies and what they can bring to the table because they can interface with us in various ways across multiple disciplines. So when you talk about a research park and how they engage, then what we have to talk about is what are the characteristics of a university industry project. If we're moving from experiential education to actually a bi-directional feedback loop of industry engaging on campus and giving us validation and feedback along the way, then we're actually going to talk about what those look like. And so for the companies that engage with us, we're looking for elevated awareness of what their problems are, an increased competitiveness for that organization, stronger organization overall, whether it's from a human resources perspective or a process perspective. We have new product development and we work on improved efficiency. These are the things that we see from companies that engage with us. And we do work and research with undergraduates with some of the best in the world. In our park, we have companies like SKF, the largest global bearing manufacturer in the world. We have Erie Insurance. We have Hero BX, which does biofuels work. And we have process and data automation, which is at the cusp of Industry 4.0. So we try to do these characteristics so we're not only doing experiential in our classroom, but actually bringing that feedback loop in. And that's what really changes our classroom and what our faculty look like. So now I'd like to transition to people. And when we talk about faculty and moving the culture from experiential to more of this open lab strategy, you have to hire the right people and then understand the balance of faculty you have. So a lot of times in higher education, people try to put an intermediary organization in between faculty and industry. And that's to kind of broker those deals and make sure that the faculty can do what they do best and the industry does what they do best. But what I would assert, and my colleagues as well, is that we actually need higher education to move the culture more towards the industry that they serve. So while in some cases, intermediary organizations like a career planning office serve a very specific purpose, one of the cons to having an intermediary in between the faculty and the organizations that we serve is that it allows everybody to do exactly what they want to do in the culture that they're used to doing. And if anything, higher education has always required industry to move closer to the higher ed model. But what we're saying is in our undergraduate institution, we're requiring higher ed to shift closer to where industry is. And that's an important distinction that you'll see in our faculty ranks. One of the things that we talk about with our faculty is why are you educating? And it's important to ponder these things. So David Labouré actually asked whether or not we're actually educating for the best hopes of our society and remaking the society in the image of those hopes, whether or not we should be educating from the point of society as it currently needs, or whether we should promote individual hopes and dreams of our students. You can see that if we have industry engaged, we probably are not working on a societal piece. Now, there's no right or wrong answer to this, but it is important to understand how your faculty view their education goals, because that also drives something from Alice Lamb that talks about their perspective on industry academic collaborations. And Alice actually breaks it down into 4 different groups. One are the pure traditionalists, which believe that academic and industry should never cross streams. Then we have the pragmatic traditionalists, believing that yes, it happens, but they should be very distinct. Oftentimes they feel like they've sold out when they work with industry, but they understand the need for it. And then we have the hybrids that really understand the fundamental importance of crossing those streams of industry and academia, but that there really needs to be pretty strong boundaries. And then there are entrepreneurial people that actually say there should not be boundaries at all. Let's just bring it all together and see what we can accomplish. Again, there's no right or wrong answer, but if you can understand the balance of your faculty makeup at your college, and then understand where you want that balance to be, it can be one data point in how you hire faculty going forward. And why that's important is you don't want to bring everything from your research park together with these companies and invite a company in only to find out that you have a school filled with pure traditionalist faculty that really are not going to help. Okay, so now that we've talked about the real estate, the people, the place, and the systems, I'm gonna actually turn it over to Chuck, because at the end of the day, as much as I prepare my faculty and what we do on campus, it does become a part of real estate, and his expertise will help you understand that better.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you, AURP, for having us. My name is Chuck Peters. I'm the managing partner of Altair Real Estate, and we are Penn State Barron and Knowledge Park's partner in the day-to-day administration of the park, as well as working with Amy and her team as we attract companies. And one of the things that I'm excited to talk to you all about today is sort of this new reality of real estate post-pandemic. And I think there's just 3 quick things that I thought we should touch on: understanding the competitive nature of the market, and thinking about some of the lessons we've learned during the pandemic. And I want to close with interacting with real estate professionals, because it's something in our years of work with not only Penn State, but others like the Buffalo Niagara Medical Campus and Pat Whalen over at Niagara University with the Tourism Institute and others, is that being connected with the commercial real estate community and how commercial real estate executives think is a pretty important part to a successful park. So first, let's just talk, and I'm sure, you know, as we listen to sessions at this virtual conference, many people are going to talk about the realities of what's happened with COVID-19. But I think there's some fascinating statistics that have recently come out. One, during this pandemic, only 3 metropolitan areas have seen growth in their use of office real estate. That's Austin, Chattanooga in Tennessee, and then southeastern Washington State. That's out of 250 markets monitored. So holy smokes, to those of us that have a whole bunch of real estate that we're working on keeping occupied to the benefit of our universities, that can be a little intimidating, especially as you've driven around your parks in the last few months with not a lot of cars in the parking lots. With that said, though, if you look at the number of unemployed folks out there, office, which I think translates well into what we do at the research parks, is actually faring better than other parts of the real estate economy. Obviously, retail hit the hardest, hospitality, but light industrial, labs, and office have actually done pretty well. And here's one, I think back to when we were all in Huntsville a few years ago talking about co-working spaces and densification, and those of us that have these big leafy parks, what are we going to do, because there's so much competition out there that's interested in being downtown. What's interesting is you fast forward today and only 15.9% of all new office developments are occurring right now in central business districts. So for those of us that have parks in the suburbs, there's some good signs. People are interested in some additional space between them and the folks they're working with. And Tom will talk a bit more about that. The other thing, occupancy's been relatively stable but rent growth is going to lag a bit. Hot metros, San Francisco, Orlando, Nashville, seeing rents sink, New York City. And I think that all of this is going to lead to those of us in this industry realizing that modern systems for how we treat our buildings, and Tom will talk a bit more about that, are going to become increasingly important. Those of us with labs already understand that, but our office spaces are going to need that as well. So I think one of the biggest lessons that we learned throughout the pandemic is that the ways we used to collaborate, whether it was through hosting conferences or at Knowledge Park here, we called it Party in the Park, the medical campus over in Buffalo calls it Beakers and Beer, and all of these kinds of events just stopped. And so how, one of the reasons people like to be in our parks is the collaboration with the university itself, the university students, and industry in general. So how do we do that? And I think that I like talking a little bit about what our friend Pat Whalen's been doing up at Niagara University with Trek. He almost immediately moved all of their meetups to virtual, which I think was really very, I'm talking the middle of March, he started doing that. I know most of us have done similar things since. But I think beyond that, we have to think about how does our technology and how do our labs become something that extend beyond where groups of people have to be? How can we open those up to smaller groups and safely do that? And then I think as we transition into the commercial real estate discussion and leasing and commercial real estate executives interacting with your university to sign a lease, I think we have to think about virtual tours and Google Earth to show amenities near your park. Amy mentioned a few minutes ago that we actually added a new tenant, and since the beginning of the pandemic at a park with approximately 200,000 square feet, we added almost 14,000 square feet of new tenants. One, a global engineering firm that needed electrical engineers that are being trained at Penn State Barron, and the other an IT services provider that needed computer science folks that they could work with and collaborate with. Neither of those places could come see the space because they were early in the pandemic and Pennsylvania was shut down. We weren't allowed to show space. So we had to adapt very quickly, and hopefully all the rest of you have done that as well. I want to close on interacting with commercial real estate executives. It's something that Amy and I have learned working together over the last 3 or 4 years, is that oftentimes we will be going forward with a research relationship with a company, and we're very, very excited. And the research folks are looking at the lab space, looking at the office space, thinking about how we can get a lease done very quickly. And then at the 11th hour, the commercial real estate executive from the company comes along and says, well, wait a second, we need to understand these lease terms better. And I've seen it over my career where it's easy to forget that just because we're a research park and have all of the vast resources of the universities that we're associated with, that the commercial real estate folks still have a say in how these transactions happen. And so I think that it's very important that as you're going through this process, you think through the fact that your mission as a research park is slightly different than the commercial real estate executive's mission as the person dotting the I's and crossing the T's as it comes to leasing. I also think it's important really to think about how you're going to compensate those brokers that might bring you a deal and or the commercial real estate executive that comes along and says, wait, what about me? So hopefully that helps you all think a bit about life post-pandemic as it comes to commercial real estate, which whether we like to acknowledge it all the time or not, in the research park business, we are also in the real estate business. And I think that next up, my partner, Tom Hardy, is going to share with all of you a bit about the planning process. Tom's a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners and works with our clients as we think about what space should look like. So thank you all very much. Thanks, AURP, and I'll turn it over to you, Tom, and you want me to do your slides?
Yeah. Thanks, Chuck, and appreciate the opportunity, AURP, to speak at the conference. So as Chuck mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about the planning perspective and the framework that we use. So going back to kind of where we started here, thinking about this in terms of people, place, and systems, right? So three interrelated concepts, and we think about this almost as a three-legged stool, right? You can't just have two of the three, you need all three. So I'm going to start and talk a little bit about the people aspect of this, and what we find oftentimes is that, engaging your users of your park in planning. So by that we mean faculty, students, the outside industry partners that are leasing space from you or doing program in your park, engaging those folks, right? It sounds pretty obvious and simple, but in our experience, it's not often done. And when it is done, it's not often done in a very intentional manner. So we would encourage you to do that. And as you're thinking about the future of your parks, making sure that you are reaching out in those intentional ways and getting that feedback. What we find is that, in our experience, maybe 80% of that feedback is what we expected. But the other 20%, the piece that really can help inform that planning process in a way that if we hadn't have done that, we wouldn't have known about, is we get feedback that maybe is a little bit more nuanced or detailed. It has some aspects of things that we haven't considered. I mean, one of the things, because we also are in the property management business, that we get feedback, some of the best feedback we get around building design and planning is from folks that are actually servicing the building, right? From our facilities maintenance staff and so on, that really understand the intricacies of how buildings actually work in practice. So again, we encourage you as part of your planning process to do that outreach. I'm going to talk a little bit about Knowledge Park here at Barron. One example of that is that as we were designing a new facility, some of the feedback that we got from, especially from students, was about having more space in the classroom and going away from kind of the rows of seating where there's really very little distance between those rows. So if a professor's coming to look over a student's shoulder to look at what's on their laptop to offer some feedback, that they have a little bit more personal space there. So that's something that we heard really from before the pandemic, and that ties into the place concept that I'm going to talk a little bit about now. So, we've titled this particular slide, less isn't more anymore, right? So certainly for those of, from a university perspective, if you look at kind of trends where things had been, 5 or more years ago, in terms of, it was really all about how do we accomplish as much as possible? How do we serve as many students as possible within a given square footage? And now we're starting to rethink that a little bit. And so, certainly on the one hand of the pendulum was kind of the registrar perspective of, how many folks can we actually fit in the space? And now if you read, the newspaper, you might think that, office space is going to be obsolete, right? That no one wants to come into a congregate environment anymore. And we think that the reality is going to be somewhere in the middle, obviously. And we think that density isn't going to be dead, but it's going to be rethought. So what do we mean by that? So on the site context side, for those of you that have urban parks, right, having outdoor space kind of built into your site planning is going to be critical. So those are things like courtyards, maybe even rooftop areas. We've seen balconies that have been incorporated in other buildings. So it is a little bit more challenging in the urban environment, but it's still really important. And then certainly on the suburban park side, having some areas for like walkability, connection, over and above just kind of the sea of parking, but actually places where folks can kind of congregate and meet up outside. So that's going to be important from a site context side. In terms of the inside of the building, so we are really seeing, planning for both for areas for collaboration within the space and also areas for individual work. And so you can see here from some example pictures on the collaborative side, we're seeing this done more informally, right? So you can see the middle picture there is a handful of high back seats. It's done so people can meet informally, have some sense of privacy, but it's not like a formal 4-person office conference room. But the other thing is that there still is going to be that need for individualized work areas. So you can see that there in terms of that kind of phone booth pod. So one of the examples that we use here is just a recent building that Penn State built here at Knowledge Park is the Advanced Manufacturing and Innovation Center. So this slide is just showing that a lot of thought went into how to organize kind of the layout of the classrooms. And we really look closely at, density and people per square foot. That's what the table on the right is showing you. So we went for a lower density option that allowed for some more flexibility. So finally, on the systems perspective, the idea here is that user perceptions and preferences are really going to drive change, and you really need to be kind of ahead of these as part of the planning process. So Chuck mentioned feedback that we're getting and just questions about, we never got questions to the extent that we have over the last 6 months about air filtration, MERV filtration, right? All of those things are now becoming more commonplace in terms of folks are asking for those things. And we see that as that's going to be a leading, those are going to drive change, right? And so we think that we'd really encourage you to kind of be ahead of that process, listen to that user feedback, because eventually if you're not doing those things, you're going to be at a competitive disadvantage with the folks in your market that you're competing with that are doing those. So just want to wrap up and talk a little bit about kind of making the case for some of those decisions in the planning process. In terms of that, we just would really focus on kind of making the business case for some of those harder decisions in terms of, kind of increasing open space, increasing kind of the quality and of your HVAC. Those are often decisions that are going to require greater upfront capital costs, but have lower life cycle costs. So making the business case for that is really something that's important. That's something that we work on doing quite often in our role here. So just going to wrap up with that. And I think now we have some time for questions and answers.